Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tenant Talk Live. We'll give it a couple minutes to let people join. I see a bunch of names popping up now. If you could put in the chat where you're calling in from, just so we can get a sense of where folks are, that would be great. And then as a reminder, there's a poll at the bottom just to get a little bit more info about you as well, what type of housing you live in. And also, I was wondering if anyone could let me know if they've received rental assistance during the pandemic. There's a question in there too. But tonight we're thankfully joined by Fabian from let me get this right, the Atlantic Towers Plaza Tenant Association in New York City. He was able to organize with a lot of other tenants in his building against a landlord who's using facial recognition cameras. And so we're really excited to have a conversation about tenant organizing, surveillance of tenants, and just the intersection between poverty and technology and inequality and technology. And this conversation was started because one of our board members, I'll see if she's on, Shalonda Rivers from Florida, mentioned that her property, she lives in a multifamily property in South Florida, and she told me and Olivia that a camera was placed right side of her apartment that was showing into her house, and she said that there are a lot of the tenants in her property took issue with that for obvious reasons, and so Fabian's gonna speak to that. And just right before, Fabian, before you hand it over to you, I just want to remind everyone, if you could put where you're from in the chat, and I will call that out really quickly as people start doing that. Okay, no one wants to tell me where they're from, that's fine. Sherry from Ventura, California. Joshua from Eau Claire, Wisconsin.
Cool.
Megan Cutler from Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Bambi Hayes Brown, one of our board members from Forest Park, Georgia. Olivia, my comrade from DC. Tamara Zwienak from Franklin, North Carolina. Dana Smith from Boston, Massachusetts. AJ Jelks from Racine, Wisconsin. Marie Izzo from Medford, Massachusetts. Bree Kirkhart from Lawrence, Kansas. Patricia Washington from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Crystal Griffin from Las Vegas. Mary Brown from Madison. Israel Ortega from Las Vegas. Gianni from Berkeley. Veronica from Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Okay, we finally have a tri-stater, Desiree from Monroeville, New Jersey. So Fabian, you're not alone.
Yes.
Linda from Southeast Minnesota. Denise from New York. Christina from New York. John Leary from Philly, Pennsylvania. Nitu Nair, NLIHC, a new NLIHC employee. She's from Michigan. And Esther from Monterey. So Fabian, you're not alone as the only Northeasterner. But and I see Tranae has joined us. Oh, great. Okay,
Good
so
evening,
Fabian,
everyone. Sorry about
hi,
that.
Tranae. No problem.
Hi.
Thanks for joining. We really appreciate it. So yeah, Tranae will be joining us as well. She worked closely with Fabian on this as well. And so I'm going to hand it over to them now to discuss their organizing in New York City.
Yeah, so Tranae, I'll take it away since you kind of jumped on a little bit. So my name is Fabian Rogers. I am, I guess, what you call a community organizer out here in Brooklyn, New York. Born and raised. I've been doing a lot of organizer work. I started out of necessity in anti-surveillance work, and then I found myself working for a nonprofit called Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. And then just recently, I picked up a job through Senator Jabari Brisport's office as a constituent advocate for District 25 out here in Brooklyn. So I've been in a couple of different arenas, but all starting from anti-surveillance. And what's most important here is that the reason why I'm here today is because almost about 3 years ago at this point, our landlord, Tranae and I's landlord, Robert Nelson from Nelson Management, who owns more than I think around or more than a dozen different apartment complexes of all different types of housing jurisdictions within the greater New York area, ranging from Brooklyn, with here at Atlantic Plaza Towers to, in Midtown Manhattan and things like that. So what happened was in him, the history being Atlantic Plaza Towers was a Mitchell-Lama building early on in the 2000s. When he picked it up in 2010, he slowly made the transition it from Mitchell-Lama to rent stabilized housing. So basically those two terms, I know there's a lot of people that are not from New York. Basically Mitchell-Lama and rent stabilized are just forms of different rent controlled housing. So I feel like rent control is a popular term interstate wide. So if anything, just understand that he was doing conversions of different of rent control buildings. So in that, he basically found a way to expedite the process of being able to have affordable housing units, but in the case of a vacancy, be able to flip the apartments to be market rate, which is drastically higher than your average affordable housing unit. So within those plannings, what he was planning to do was add little trinkets and fun things to the housing that make it trendy for, new up and coming, gentrifiers that are coming to Brooklyn, New York. So one of those being this facial recognition system. It was a heat mapping software that was offered through the startup company called Stonelock Technology. Their recent startup, and this was their first venture within residential housing. They did not have a history in residential housing and doing surveillance for said housings. So this was going to be their first venture without proper validation studies, the proper background information to further support the efficacy of the technology, as well as the usability of it, to like the effects that come from it with heat mapping software. And a brief run through, heat mapping is different from your regular everyday video recognition software where you put your face to a kiosk and it gets a scan of your face. The heat mapping software takes it a step further where there's a use of UV rays or whatever the case may be that basically get past the first layer of your skin to get like a weather heat mapping. So you know how you have like a weather forecast, man, that's like, okay, for this week, we'll have cool storm fronts and hot cold fronts and things like that going across the map, and you see a bunch of different colors and things like that. Think of that, but for your face. Yeah. So yeah, it wasn't our idea, wasn't anything that we asked for, but again, this was a tool that was going to be trendy, potentially for gentrifiers that were coming into New York and willing to pay the market share rate upon, the landlord flipping out apartments from rent stabilized to market rate. So I usually don't bring this up, but because this is like tenant talk, it kind of feels necessary to bring that context before we even get to the whole process of what pushback looked like, because you have to understand that context of why would he even think to bring heat mapping here? But again, this was a conversation that didn't actually involve the tenants that were already staying at Atlantic Plaza Towers, And mind you, on top of that, when you're talking about the tenant body from Atlantic Plaza Towers, we're talking about legacy tenants that have been here since its creation back in the late 1960s. So around, I think this place was erected in like late 1960s. I almost want to say 68 or 69. So it's been around for a while. A lot of the tenants that originally are here, they've either still here or have given their apartments through succession to next of kin. And so you have predominantly elderly Black female sort of population running through Atlantic Plaza Towers. So there's a lot of culture, a lot of activist backgrounds, as this place has been like the hub for a lot of organizing movements from decades ago when there was much more of like an activist presence within Brooklyn. So all that to then have, a landlord try to expedite the process of erasing the culture for the sake of basically profits. So again, fast forward, we get to July, or summertime of 2018. He puts in this application to ask DHCR, which is the Division of Housing and Community Renewal. They're the governing enterprise over Atlantic Plaza Towers, as we're a rent stabilized, building unit. And that's the governing entity over our building for anything that happens within the building. So landlord can't go willy-nilly without going through DHCR first. So he puts in an application to then try to try to install the heat mapping software into the building. He puts in 2 separate applications, that of which are not at the same time. So 249 Thomas Boylan and 216 Rockaway learned about this at 2 separate times. So within the fall of 2018, it was chaotic, on top of which there was lobby renovations being done, again, a part of all that sort of making this place more and more marketable to the gentrifiers that are potentially coming to New York. So in the lobby renewals were the mailboxes that would have given us notice from DHCR of what was happening in the building. A lot of those mails got lost in translation because in the midst of the lobby renewals or the lobby renovations, the mailboxes were being updated. And so a lot of mail got lost in the chaos because ain't no mailman trying to find where the mailboxes are. So I don't know if that was done through conspiracy, but it felt pretty much like it. So we were already at a how could I put this? We were already at a standstill on the fact that we were trying to figure out what to do here. What is this technology? What do we have going on here? So I think the first thing that happened, and this was before I was even a tenant organizer with Atlantic, I was more just like a tenant that always cared about what was going on, always wanted to keep a close ear. The original tenant association had an emergency meeting within fall of 2018 to figure out what was going on and how to deal with it. And the first move of action was to do a collective informal opposition to DHCR by using the surveys for those who got them, by using the surveys that were given through DHCR to give our thoughts on what we felt about this docket number, which was the application for the technology itself. We would use the surveys and send them in mass rather than one by one to give a mass response as sort of like, this is like a mass direct action as immediate as possible to figure out, to let DHCR know, like, we never asked for this. This wasn't something that we were intending for. We wanted actual housing improvements. We wanted tweaks to our apartment where like folks don't have pest issues, or updates to cabinets that have been falling apart and things like that. Things that you should be calling 311 to like have handled. So in the informal oppositions, basically the original tenant association reached out to an old legal aid that had been helping in years past in terms of the Mitchell-Lama transition and trying to deal with all that sort of stuff. So Brooklyn Legal Services ends up getting involved. The Tenants' Rights Coalition department in particular that's based out here near Ocean Hill, Brownsville, Brooklyn. So they get involved, and the first thing of action that they tell us after the informal oppositions is we should be getting ourselves involved in media. We should be figuring out how to do a legal opposition. So from fall to winter 2018, all the way up until about fall 2019, basically Brooklyn Legal Services uses their communications department in conjunction with us, and we collaborate basically to figure out how do we go about the best media outreach we can do. Because what we've realized along the way is the problem here is that there's no legal statute to take your landlord to court over surveillance technology. Now, later along the way, after we figured out how to deal with this, you kind of, through talking to some organizers, there's the idea of maybe taking them to court for human rights violations and things like that. But at the time, there was no legal statute to try to sue the landlord to figure out how to get, reparations or whatever the case may be. So the best next of kin action to do was to affect the reputation of both DHCR and the landlord, Robert Nelson of Nelson Management. So in that, we used the media outreach, whether it was different conferences we got invited to, city hall meetings that we got invited to, private sessions with different organizing groups, whether it was in the civil organizing atmosphere, the legal organizing atmosphere, or the tech organizing atmosphere. And basically along the way, we kind of taught ourselves and utilized original housing organizing strategies and adjusted it to surveillance tech organizing to basically think of this as another pest along the many other pests that folks deal with within housing organizing and housing rights, instead of thinking about this as a technology only problem. So that helped us build a way to effectively come at the reputation of the landlord and DHCR while we had it, because you only have this bubble of attention for so long. Like even now, we still get called and stuff like that, but it's because of the success of taking advantage of the moment that we had at the time. So with that, as the year goes on, we build a buzz, we build a bubble, we keep on putting pressure on Robert Nelson. Summer comes around, and we're at a point where we have different groups of different bubbles all supporting us and things like that. And we get to a point where we agree around fall of 2019, around September, October or so. We want to invite elected officials to have a tenant town hall basically at Atlantic Towers in collaboration with other civil organizations we've been working with, to basically figure out a legal standard or to figure out what bills need to be put in place in order to deal with this problem. Because what you realize is in this organizing, it's not just a matter of a one bill policy is a fix it. It's not a one bill fix all. It's a matter of pancaking policies on one another in order to touch on different housing jurisdictions, housing needs, as well as housing protections, and deterrence for landlords that want to take advantage of affordable housing, loopholes and things like that. So after we get organized and have several different elected officials ready to come between different assembly members and even the public advocate's office out here in New York City, the day of the tenant town hall, which was a few days before Thanksgiving, this is November, fall 2019 again. We have the day of the town hall, everything's going well, we're having a really productive conversation. Here comes Robert Nelson for the second time I've seen him in my life since a technology meeting where we try to have a consensus on what needs to be done moving forward. He makes a surprise visit at the tenant town hall, and he agrees publicly to basically withdraw the application. And then within the coming days, we get an official letter in the mail from DHCR, basically having the withdrawal. Now, before that, in May of 2019, BLS, Brooklyn Legal Services, they supplement our informal oppositions to DHCR by sending a legal opposition with a whole bunch of their own points from all the research and all the intakes that they did with tenants information, send it to DHCR. Both oppositions of which that still have yet to get a response to this day. So I just want to let y'all know. But I say all that to say, we took a really nuanced approach at dealing with surveillance. We dealt with it from a housing organizing perspective and utilized a lot of the tactics we learned along the way and work in conjunction with different civil, legal, and tech organizations and organizers, tech analysts, digital analysts, tech researchers, digital experts, lawyers, attorneys, and different like grassroots organizers, just working using different means of approach to figure out how to deal with this problem, because there simply wasn't a legal stature to deal with this. And so Tranae and I ended up becoming like the front runners for the movement, because again, predominantly most of Atlantic is predominantly elderly people, if anything. So they didn't have the same sort of speed. They did have the passion, but for a lot of the quick turnaround where folks wanted us to be at different conferences, whether it was in this country, out this country, or being at different city hall hearings, or having to speak with different, folks of authority on a last moment's notice, it took a lot of effort between me and Tranae to really be in those spaces, to really amplify what's going on at Atlantic and really think about the bigger sense of housing surveillance in New York in general. So I can list you down a couple of different, surprising titles that we've met along the way, just in terms of just handling whatever awareness we could along the way to really amplify what was going on here, because we couldn't get a clear answer from the folks that had control over what was going on at this place. So hopefully that's a good synopsis. Tranae, feel free to add whatever other thoughts that I'm missing. I apologize.
Fabian,
yep.
Real quick, that was great. Really appreciate that. I asked this not to like as a gotcha. I live in an apartment. Like if there was facial recognition anywhere in my apartment, I'd be very upset. But I was wondering, and Esther asked this too, how did the facial recognition help the landlord? Was it for entry into the building, or was it?
Yeah, it was for entry into the building. Tranae, and again, I talked for a whole bunch. If you want to speak, feel free. But if you want me to take it, I can take it. It's whatever. I don't want to take up the whole conversation.
Fine. I think you covered everything really nice and compact. This was, I feel like it was like a 2.5 year journey, and you kind of just put all of that into a snippet. So I appreciate that. I probably couldn't have did. Fabian knows I'm a talker. As far as what Nelson wanted to use the facial recognition for, he wanted to use it for entry into the building. I think the initial reasoning was that they found a flaw with our key fob system, which was that the key fob could be duplicated, which we found was a lie. It was never. No one in our establishment had ever gotten a key duplicated. It was just something he pulled out of the air to say, no, this is why we need something new, because that can be duplicated. But I mean, it wasn't along the same line. So he tried to submit this new pieces of surveillance as a modification to the surveillance that we already had, which we had never seen facial recognition. So how is it a modification to a key fob? This is a completely different system. So he began this journey the wrong way by applying for a modification when this was a completely new piece of security that he was trying to layer on top of what we had already, which was a key fob system, surveillance, security guards that walk the premises. We have them in both buildings. We have superintendents on the premises all the time. And we also have gates all over the place where you have to tap your key fob in order to get in, go to the grocery store, go to the parking lot, go into the park in the back of the building. There's actually a key fob point at our laundry room as well, but they always keep that door open so we don't have to tap it. But if they close the door, we would have to tap our key fob to do laundry as well. So yeah, he just wanted it to have us scan our face to get into the building. But personally, I felt that he was using it as a tool to help him in this very near future that we're in, where, I mean, people are at risk of eviction, but we're now in a space where landlords can't just evict a tenant for no reason. We have certain laws in place that don't allow for us to be evicted, but there are loopholes there. So if you can deem that tenant a nuisance or a threat to the rest of the community, you can be evicted and they can get rid of you under that guise. So they're going to use things like facial recognition and cameras to prove that some tenants are a nuisance or breaking clauses in their leases or just small infractions. They'll be able to catch on camera literally and put it under your door and say, hey, you broke the lease here, so you have to be gone in 60 days. So that's really why we feel like the facial recognition cameras were put there. In addition, just to add, like, we have cameras on our floor. So when we get off the elevator to walk into our apartment, there are cameras watching us the whole time, from when we get on the corner of Atlantic and Rockaway outside, because there's cameras outside, all the way to walking in, checking your mailbox, getting on the elevator, talking to your neighbors, all the way until you get into your door, you are being watched. So there is plenty of time and space for them to catch you doing something, let you drop a piece of mail or put a scuff mark on the floor, or your dog pees outside. You know, they're looking for anything that they can say, this person does this amount of times throughout the month. This is a nuisance. So that's that.
Yeah, so I live in DC, and there was a property here, a very large, what was it? It was not Section 8, but it was a HUD subsidized property that they started implementing all these really, really rigid surveillance tactics, but they didn't use cameras or anything. But they were trying to find people loitering or smoking outside of their general apartment, because it was like a courtyarded type apartment. So it's in the similar vein of how like there may have been something in the pipeline that he was trying to do down the road or something like that. So yeah, that
think
resonates.
Tenants have to keep in mind is that little things happen around your neighborhood and little things change, but it's all for some bigger picture that we are just not aware of in the future, that these landlords, they're not just in it. Okay. They're not just thinking, okay, next year and the year after. They're thinking, okay, 10 years from now, how much money are we bringing in and who's going to be in that building? So all of these little changes that we're seeing being made and little things that are being done that we think are normal, we really need to just pay attention and just be on the lookout and just not let anything fly past you like, oh, they're going to do that in any way. No, don't let them do it, because that's just one step closer to that 10-year goal that they have. So if you just, I'm really glad we were able to push back against this facial recognition thing, because I can't imagine if now we have facial recognition in this building and it was a heat mapping system, and we're dealing with COVID right now. So I mean, I can see that going wrong so many different ways. I mean, people could be being taken out of this building because their temperature is up, right, just trying to come home. Right. So, I mean, we just have to be careful.
For sure. So I want to get to some questions because a lot of people and comments too. Cora Hayes, who's worked with NLIHC for a while now, she said, I'm very impressed by seeing the younger generation stepping up to the plate to fight for rights of all residents. The older soldiers are still in the trenches, but allowing the younger residents to step up. Kudos. And Angela raised her hand. Angela, I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to ask your question live. You're unmuted. And then also, Christina, you had asked as well to unmute. So you both are unmuted if you'd like to ask your questions. While they do that.
Hi, this is Christina.
Hi.
I was just wondering, because I live in Syracuse, New York. I live in a HUD housing building, Clinton Plaza, and we have a fob key system, and we have 24-hour security where visitors have to sign in with photo ID. What I was wondering was, because we even have a system where if we have a visitor, the visitor has to call in between the first two sets of doors. They have to call the apartment that they're visiting, and we have to physically push on our phone when they're to allow them into the building. I guess my question is, how advanced is their system in Brooklyn? Because I mean, we have cameras all throughout the building as well. It's a 23-story building, but I'm just wondering how much their security actually does compared to what the system does for us.
Great question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just want to start by saying your building sounds very close to ours. Our building is 24 stories. We have security. We have the intercom system set up in between our front door and our foyer door, where you have to call whoever your visitor is has to call, and we have to press a button to let them up. And they still, to get through the next door, they have to speak to our security guard, and our security guard has to let them through that next door. And then they're still being surveilled and monitored on the way up. So we are very familiar with what you just said, because that is our reality currently right now. And they still, on top of that, wanted to put in facial recognition.
Okay, then I guess my next question to you would be, because like in my lease, let's say if one of my daughters came to the house and I let them in, they signed in, and they didn't, like, say they came to my apartment, and then after they left my apartment, they caused a nuisance on a different floor, then I'm actually held responsible for whatever my visitor does. Have you had trouble with that, where they're giving you a hard time?
Not personally, but that sounds similar to what would happen here. Like, you're responsible for your guests. So if something was to happen on the premises with a guest of yours on a different floor, wherever, you are still responsible for your guests. Essentially, you're the one that let them onto the premises.
Right. It just seems weird that they're trying to get facial recognition, especially through COVID and the pandemic, and not everybody's eligible for the shots at this point.
Well, this was actually way before the pandemic. This was application went in 2018, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So if we were not able to push back against it then we would have been dealing with it now, and circumstance could be a lot different in regard to how we're handling the pandemic in this building.
Okay.
Got it. Esther asked, do you know what the application was that was used? Maybe so we can be aware of.
It was a modification for surveillance. I don't know the exact form name, but it's through DHCR, the Department of Housing and Community Renewals. He went to put through this.
Got it.
Yeah, it didn't fall under an MCI, like a major capital improvement, or like an IAI, individual apartment improvement. It was a modification. So that's why I was able to kind of slick through the trenches, because things like that shouldn't be considered a major capital improvement, because it shouldn't be like a burden for the entire tenant body to deal with. So that was one legal thing that popped up with working in conjunction with BLS to build like an argument as to like what this falls under. How can we like not have this happen type of thing. So
yeah. So Carrie, I think you had answered her question while she asked it, because she was asking, was this in relation to the BLM protest? But like you said, it was 2018 to 2019. But she did ask a good question about.
It kind of happened. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with BLM, but it just 2018. I want to say it's kind of 2016. We kind of started to see gentrification in this neighborhood, and we believe it's just a part of the gentrification process.
Sure, for sure. And she also asked this question, I think this might be something, I was kind of interested in this as well. You know, were you working, it sounds like this was kind of a multi-sector campaign, like you were working with legal groups and media and different types of like tenant organizing. Was there any other key partnerships, like any memorable ones outside of like Brooklyn Legal Services?
Yes. Well, I don't know if I would call it a partnership, but what kind of sparked my confidence in this pushback was AI Now. They were very helpful in getting us information. Also, I found, actually BLS sent this to me, but it was a paper by Joy Bulmwini called Gender Shades, which she did a research study on how algorithms are biased against brown people of color. They just don't see us because data sets are not made with anything that represents us in them. So they end up fearing us, and we end up being locked out of our homes and not being able to make commands to these new technological things because we are seen as a threat to them. There were studies done where congressmen were showed as terrorists. So it just showed all the studies that we found that just gave us the research and the numbers that showed that this technology is nowhere near ready for market. Those things were very, very helpful, and they're still all available. I think Fabian provided some readings, I'm not sure, but we can definitely provide some information if anyone wants to look into these things. But definitely Gender Shades was a great start for me. I believe her website has things kind of in bite-sized pieces, so you don't have to read through the whole research paper, which I found to be really helpful because I don't come from a background of academia and I don't want to read a 60-page paper. So that was very helpful.
For sure. Esther raised her hand. I think maybe she wanted to follow up on her question. So Esther, I just unmuted you if you'd like to.
Yeah, thanks. So I think you mentioned at the very beginning the name of the program, but I can't remember what it was. But besides that, so I don't know how familiar you guys are with the fact that property management companies are all selling their information to each other through an AI platform, and it's being used all across the country. And there's a book by a guy named James Nelson called Stealing Home. And he's updated the information that he collected in the study to more recent times, which I've taken to my congressman's office. And they're very focused on AI and data collection with regard to housing. So I strongly suggest you guys take this, case to, and actually it's Senator Amy Klobuchar's office that's really working on the AI portion of it nationally. But this is part of a bigger, I don't want to say conspiracy, but it's this interconnected, use of AI and data collection on all renters. And they're very embedded, in the political process, and they're very organized, and they use it in multiple ways. This is the first time I'm hearing about it through a facial recognition, but it makes sense because they are trying to find ways of manipulating the renter market and the ability for renters to actually even rent another place when they've been evicted or have moved out, because they share all your information across this platform that they access. And if you haven't paid 100% of what they say you owed them, they actually will deny you rental somewhere else. And it's really starting to seem like a very kind of big brother manipulation of something that everybody needs, which is housing. At some point, where do you go if all this data is collected on you and you have no way of fighting it? So I think it's important that this kind of a story be shared in DC more, because there is a serious focus on, this data issue and the collection and the use of AI.
Definitely.
Thank you for sharing that. And most definitely gonna look into that reading stealing home. I'm taking notes on what you're saying. But yeah,
he's actually also got videos on YouTube that you can look up. His name is James M. Nelson.
Thank you.
And
So
he's got like a 20-minute presentation that's a real condensed version of the study. And I'm actually working with some academics on getting the study peer reviewed so that we can, have real solid academic, confirmation as we take it up the chain.
oh, this is amazing. I would love to be in the loop on that if we could.
He will do a webinar for you. I've had him do some for me with small groups, and you get to ask your questions, and he's very much available to kind of explain it more to you and stuff. But this is something that I really think is going to become a bigger problem than what we're seeing now. And the whole facial recognition aspect of it just brings a whole nother level of crazy to it.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. I mean, just in terms of this, I have to add context to it. And this isn't something this isn't any devil's advocate type of thing, but it's more just like understanding the bigger picture. The reason why a lot of this happens is because there isn't a holistic nationwide GDPR compliance within the United States, which is the sort of compliance, and I forget what the acronym stands for in full definition. I apologize, but it's something along the lines of having a national standard that limits the use of these types of intrusive software. So if anything, the US has become a sort of guinea pig in sorts, where there are consulates, from other countries that are based out here. We've spoken to one, the German consulate in New York, where they're here basically doing research on looking at the breaking things first, asking questions later perspective of things. So when we're talking about surveillance,
sorry to interrupt, but that is the term they go by, moving fast and breaking things, which is horrible for us. Sorry, Fabian.
Yeah, no problem. So in terms of looking at that, when we're talking about surveillance, the reason why these things happen is because there hasn't been a legal statute to limit these folks in the first place. I forgot to say a long time ago, when we're talking about, you know, the idea of facial recognition and the development and the deployment of it within the states, it's being deployed where there's a cesspool in terms of legal ramifications limiting folks from doing things. So again, folks who make mistakes before they figure out the consequences that come from it, but like, because there's an economy for it, but there's no sense of law, there's going to be a lot of experimentation happening in different facets of society at the consequences of people who can't afford to be at the table to be able to defend themselves and offer their perspective, unless they end up in these types of scenarios where Tranae and I went through, and the rest of the tenants at Atlantic Plaza Towers, where we find a placement to be able to be a sort of case study in sorts, and then spread knowledge on what that happens. Because a lot of times the many different data researchers who are really popular within the states we talked to personally, and they couldn't even give us like advice. And they were like the forefront folks who would be invited to conferences to speak about AI intelligence and like the idea of how to make it more ethical. And so a lot of what we were doing was just like instinctual, intuitive, just figuring out what hole to fill, because there wasn't a sort of blueprint to deal with all of this. And that all comes from the fact that the US never thought to build a blueprint to have a rollout on how this is. So kind of like how you see the US dropping the ball with like the vaccine rollout, that's how they are with like legalities with new sort of technologies. And it takes new perspectives being in the room to think about these things as pests of already ongoing issues. Because the only thing that's new is the technology, but the uses for it are nothing new. We've seen how these things get used to expedite the erasures of culture, the erasures of, you know, communities and people for the sake of profits. That hasn't changed. The nuance of the technology and the tools to expedite that process has, and it's almost like the US is kind of like tripping first before they recognize that that's the case. And so it's sad, but it takes people who are in the trenches dealing with it firsthand to really give a proper perspective, basically from the community's impacted perspective, in order to give like proper solutions to these problems. So, yeah.
So I actually just asked, okay, Olivia just shared it. I thought there was a bill about banning facial recognition in public housing that was only, like I said, only public housing by Reps Presley, Clark, and Tlaib, and that was in 2019. I don't know if it ever passed.
And that inspired that bill to kind of happen.
Okay, sure.
At all. We don't live in public housing, so we're like, we came to you with this issue, and you did this.
Yeah, right. And the city council didn't really want to.
No one knew.
Legislature, yeah.
With city council, it's kind of funny. We realize in New York, city council bills, it's really hard to get passed. And it's something about priorities. Like, first, city council official has to like take priority over an issue. So it depends on who takes the priority of the issue to be able to push a bill in place. And this is from the work I learned with working with the nonprofit STOP, Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. So what I understand now is, because folks haven't talked to communities impacted, people are making Swiss cheese policies that are Swiss cheese in efficacy, where there are a lot of holes in them. Sounds nice on the front page, but when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, and if it's put into effect, and there's a budget behind the use of the bill, there can come a point where certain housing jurisdictions are left out of the conversation. Landlords take advantage of that. And then you have to then try to do a Band-Aid recovery to a Swiss cheese policy in the first place. The reason why that happens is because these elected officials don't take the time to talk to communities impacted to understand how to be as thorough as possible with their legislation. And don't get me wrong, legislation does get updated within weeks and months and times. Like, there's updates to bill numbers. That's why you have, 1511A, 1511B. It ends up becoming different things as, a bill processes through the government, potentially getting to the governor or whatever to get passed and then put into the budget. But in that, the conversation should be had with communities impacted in order to be as thorough as possible in the efficacy of the bills. And even if you go about doing it and talking to communities impacted, there are many different communities and many different housing jurisdictions. So you have to be mindful of all communities involved that could potentially get hit. But that's a very idealist type of, way to look at it. And elected officials themselves, not all of them are humble enough to just look past the pride of being at the forefront of the new AI tech problem. Like, a lot of folks might get in front of something for the sake of like the mini fame that you can get from it. And again, the efficacy of the bill can just fall on its face. And so, something could be presented and it's not talked about, several years later. Again, there are bills on the table that have been proposed and have been processing for quite some time. Don't get me wrong, but they're not in efficacy. Like I'm telling you now, and folks could try to correct me on this, but I'm pretty factual in this, that there are several bills in place, even in New York State, that are processing, that have been proposed, but they do not help us. And like, if Nelson were wanting to change his mind and go about this process, he could do it now. He just would have to be better with his communication, and then he'd be fine. Because the problem was that he wasn't communicating in the first place. He let DHCR do the dirty work of contacting the tenants to let them know what was going on, because he literally put in the application, didn't tell anybody about it. We got a notification from DHCR, and then we got reactive. And that's how a lot of these processes work when we're talking about very intrusive tools and devices that end up hurting communities. It's always something that comes from a very reactive process where folks that are the authority and the stakeholders, they're not proactive in the protections of their communities. They're proactive in profits. And if there was a change in that perspective, I don't see happening just because of how capitalism works. I'm really trying not to be a cynic here. I apologize, guys, but this is what we've been dealing with for the past time. There's not as many idealists as I like to see in the government. So when it comes to surveillance and things like that, it's still a work in progress, and folks treat technology like it's just this alien thing, and you can't find a way to make it ethical and find a process to look out for people impacted. And we've had these conversations time and time again. I mean, Tranae, feel free to tap.
Yeah, Fabian is absolutely right. Like, so the whole what the No Biometric Barriers Act, I believe, is what you were referencing. There were a few bills written and drafted, and they got to the start line and nothing happened after that. There's about 7 bills that were drafted to potentially help us. And a lot of those bills, we felt we were one of those Swiss cheese holes. We didn't fit into there, it didn't cover us. So we still we wouldn't have been protected anyway. So I think that there just needs to be more of a concern coming from government officials and just whoever, federal government, everyone with AI. I don't understand why it's okay for these tech companies from abroad to come here and just run wild and free, mining our data. And you're from a whole nother country. Why is this okay? I don't understand why it's okay for like these German tech giant companies to come to America, because in Germany, they have rules against this stuff. In the UK, they have rules against this stuff. But in America, no, you can just go test it out and see how it works. They're just going to move fast and break a few things. We're not going to bother any people. Oh no, we're just going to do some things. But people do end up being affected. And like, just to go back a little bit, another one of my major concerns was, I have a son. My whole family my great grandmother moved into this building, and I have now had a child. So there's generations of us that live here. And my concern is that they connect these things with the police department and the precincts. We've already had previous building staff who worked for our local precinct, and we noticed some things that weren't all the way kosher to us in regards to evicting some tenants in the past. So when this facial recognition thing came along, it was just very hair raising and scary. Just knowing that we're in the process of gentrification in Brooklyn right now. And we know that you want a different type of tenant. Our building manager actually told us this. He's making these modifications for the new tenant or whatever that is, or whatever that means. So yeah, we just don't know what can be done with the algorithms exactly. Anything could be done with them. It seems like to me, they can be connected to government agencies, police departments. They could all be intertwined to create sort of a report card for people in the city. And that will lock a lot of people out of a lot of services. And just the right to be a human being and roam freely in your community. So yes, I'm gonna stop there now. If there's any more questions.
We're getting a lot of comments in support of your work, I will say that. People are pointing out how, I've seen rumblings about this, that China uses this in certain aspects. I don't know if they do it in housing and such like that, but for security purposes, they have facial recognition in certain places. I wanted to point out something, I lost it in the chat, about Ring cameras. And I think you all pointed to this when you said working with local authorities. I live in DC, like I said, and there's a rebate program where if you install a Ring camera on your house, you will receive some money back. And that is because they're obviously working directly with law enforcement to do that. So I think,
I think another thing we need to realize in society is that nothing coming from a tech company is free. No one is giving you anything for free. They're getting something out of it. Like they're getting your data, they're getting something. A term that I've made up, I think I made it up, but I've been calling this data slavery, because we are not being paid for any of this data being taken or being used to improve systems or anything like that. So this facial recognition system that was going to be installed in our building, Stonelock, we were going to be the first of its kind. So obviously we will be improving this system with our beautiful brown faces, and we were not going to be compensated for that at all. So not only do you want to monitor me and take my biometric data forever, but you also don't want to cut me a check for it. So it's just very confusing.
Sure. Yeah. Just a kind of a related question, but not really anything too big. Gianni asked if the AIMS action outline is translated in any other languages by chance.
I hadn't ever sent it to other organizations to do translations. I apologize. I should probably do that, but like me and Tranae have kind of been overstacked with other work that we're involved in. So like the sad part is a lot of the people that we met along the way, like their life passion is this. But for us, it's different because we came at this from a very reactive point of view. Like surveillance isn't my passion. We've been in a lot of different conferences talking about it, but it's not from the perspective of, I just like talking about data and data privacy. Like I did my bare minimum research to figure out how could I get across that like we need to be contextually wise about how data privacy works. Like we need to be contextually wise about the deployment, surveillance tech and things like that. So in that, a lot of our approaches kind of reflected that. And so this got to a point where like even the action outline was more just to deal with anyone that was asking us for like, thoughts. So I will look into that possibly, but I don't have any resources off the top of my head that could convert this in other languages, but I'd love to do so.
I think I may, Fabian, so we may be okay. I think I have.
Cool. Great, so Tranae got it.
Yeah.
Tranae, someone asked if they could get in touch with you. Is it okay if I give you their email? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll put my email in the chat. It's fine. I don't. Okay. I'll do that right now.
Deborah, I was doing that for you, but anybody else that wants to get in touch, don't bombard her though. She is a mother, like she said, so and an organizer.
But feel free, if I take 48 hours to get back, like my response time is not very quick, but I will respond.
Yeah, Esther said a Spanish translation would be great, but we understand that, you know, limited resources, but yeah. Just seeing a lot of good comments. Let's see if there's any other questions. Johnny said, thank you for answering my question. She really appreciates it. She understands that you weren't able to translate. Olivia, did you have anything else you wanted to?
My only thing was to plug the Ames document that we linked to, because it sounds like a lot of folks are encountering this or are already pointing toward the need to organize and mobilize. And I think if the reaction is, I'm seeing this happen, or maybe we're already having these conversations in my community, I was hoping that Fabian and Tranae, you could kind of give a high level overview of how to read through the Ames document and like what you would focus on. How would you get started if you're starting these conversations with your neighbors?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't mind speaking on it because like I built it based on everything that we've done as like a group. Really, it's literally from step 1 to step 8. This is kind of like the process I thought of what it looks like from start to finish. Like it's based on how we went about things, and it started from as simple as having the audacity to ask questions about what's going on in your community, like looking past getting into the nitty gritty of like, okay, why is this change happening to the building? I didn't ask for this. Like I asked for like pest removal and you're out here changing the lobby. Thanks, but like, okay, what's going on here? So like basically informing yourself and others, which is just like the idea of doing your proper research to figure out what's going on. What's the type of technology being installed? Do you have a governing enterprise over the building that you live in? Are they involved? Do they intervene within that process? What stakeholder does your landlord hold within that process? And what power do you have to be able to like push back in that process? And if you could do that research for yourself before you get involved with any sort of legal representation, it's great as it makes the intake process for legal representation easier. So then you get to the point of like mobilizing and mobilizing yourself and others. So it's just like, once you have that research and figuring out what's going on here, what might this technology be, what might be the implications of it, then you go around with your neighbors because they're going to be in the same predicament if you live in multi-unit housing. And then you figure out, you don't already have a tenant association, how do you want to begin to organize around this problem? And how do you avoid it from being a thing where your landlord could end up retaliating and affecting what's going on? Because you should have the right to solicit and organize within your building, even if it's not like explicitly so. And landlords will take advantage of the fact that folks are not very in tune with what their rights are within their own housing. And a lot of times that's why affordable housing and like rent controlled units are very important, because a lot of that was put into mind in terms of the thought process in terms of maintaining affordability, because that's something against the profitability that like landlords could get. So figuring out how you can organize and keep away and keep the least resistance from, you know, your landlord from retaliating is great. Then you get to a point of mobilizing and finding yourself with other groups and potentially getting legal representation at this point. So once you figure out how your tenant organization works, how do you state this problem? How have you exhausted all resources as a grassroots organizing group, a tenant organizing group? You go and get legal aid at this point, and most likely there will not be a legal stature for you to take your landlord to court. So I would say, instead of handling the media coverage yourselves, use the communications department through the legal aid service to be the ones to funnel what traffic is coming your way, because you'll also run into the fact of reporters taking advantage of you because facial recognition is the next hot thing. So however they can get an article out, they'll do that. And that might come at the detriment of your voice being misconstrued. So you want to have a legal aid service whose communications department actually cares about what's going on with you, if possible. Big ask, I know. It's a patient process, guys. Literally, we were doing this for like 3 years. So just bear with the patience of the process. So once you get involved, if you can, with legal aid service and getting an intake done to figure out how do you approach this issue, how do you approach the reputation of your landlord and the governing enterprise, if there is one, then you basically maintain that media presence, if anything, and you maintain that media pressure, because most likely that media outreach is the most important thing that really is a make or break for how to put pressure on your landlord to not do what they're doing, how to push them away for basically being guilt tripped out of going fully through with installing said technology if they're at that point. Basically from there, what is it? You seize basically every moment you can speak, because you have, there's this thing where in all the organizing spaces, all the different conferences and things like that, that will vaguely talk about surveillance in different forms and shapes, they do not consider communities impacted and tenants and things like that. So a lot of times you have to inject yourself into those spaces and force that conversation to be had. So I would say if you're not the most, the person that's best at being a public speaker, either getting in touch with civil organizations, like I said, mobilizing yourself and others to figure out how to do that public speaking, or finding that person who's good with that public speaking to be the forefront, the face of the group, and not be their own solo person. They're representing a group, they're representing an association. And from there, they make sure that whatever's being said in public is being maintained. You have that. You basically strategize and figure out how do you take full advantage of the media pressure, because after a while you'll have a diminishing return in terms of all the media outreach that you get. Like, what do you do with all that? How do you leverage that? And that could be something as big as, once you've worked with enough different organizations or different individuals, you could mobilize that power and leverage it to have a tenant town hall, to put even more pressure and invite elected officials to get into the conversation and force them to have to listen to the communities impacted, to think about better impacting legislation that actually touches the places where it needs to, as opposed to being Swiss cheese in efficacy. And with that, with all that sort of collaboration, I say one of the most integral things that you would have to do is that you have to give and get support. So with all the collaborations that you do with many of these different organizations, a lot of them will most likely be nonprofits. A lot of them are spending their time with other issues, but they add on to yours because you fall within that sort of conversation of housing justice. So as much as they give support, you have to give it back. So in all this, I've ended up being a part of 4 or 5 different organizations as just like a member, just for the sake of, this falls under housing justice, or this falls within something that's happening that's affecting my neighborhood. So I found myself in many different spaces that typically I wouldn't have thought of, 2 or 3 years ago. And that doesn't have to be for everybody. Like, you don't have to end up being a member of every organization or whatever the case may be. But maintaining that communication, like the idea of networking, is very vital in the organizing space, because capacity is limited, priorities are limited, and maintaining that support really makes or breaks the case of you having a support net to really make your case known. For the folks that have better plugs in terms of connections in your city, maintaining the sort of, giving them support when they're having events going on, even if it's just vaguely related to what you have going on, going to other organizations, organizing meetings and figuring out who are the main faces in these groups, who are the headhunters and things like that, collaborating with different legal entities if they can give legal counsel, or talking to different tech organizations that focus on tech advocacy and figuring out, again, who are the headhunters in these rooms? What are their priorities? How have they been prioritizing them? How have they been going about their spaces? Who are they in touch with? How can you be in touch with them? And how can you give back, as well as how can they give to what you're doing in terms of your efforts? That is like the best case in terms of just building a really good support net for even when your issue's resolved or it's for the most part handled. So like after the fact, because there's more than likely a case that your landlord will retaliate. And so now this isn't a talk now of surveillance technology. This is just regular like landlord retaliation. Now this can be potentially become a housing justice issue. And so those same organizations you were connecting with before, now they become vital allies that can help you because they have this type of background and that type of thing. So I know this seemed very long-winded, and I apologize that it's a very long-winded type of thing, but that's the general 8-step guide. And I feel like I went through most of the steps in order. I might have not, I apologize, but I know everybody has the documents. Feel free to ask me whatever questions or whatever the case may be. I can put my email in the chat if anything, but that's generally the idea with all this, where you have to be a wholesome entity from back to front to really make a case for yourself, because the US is different. Like I said, there's no GDPR compliance, no general data protection regulation out here in the US. There's like little different local campaigns happening, whether it's through like ACLU, like whatever oversight, like oversight acts that they have. I forget what they call it. It's similar to the Post Act in New York City, but they call it by a different name. I think it's CAPS. I forget off the top of my head. I could send the information after, but there's different local like oversight things happening, but on a national scale, there isn't that type of oversight. So the US has left it to different states to being the ones to figure out how do you deal with this. Similar to how we saw with the pandemic, how folks let New York and like California and different states be the headhunters to figure out how do we deal with a whole worldwide pandemic. They're gonna be that same way with surveillance, just because there hasn't been a prioritizing of making it ethical and figuring out the work of what the consequences are. So there's that.
I hate to cut this great conversation short, but we are 6 minutes past our time. I really appreciate Fabian and Tranae. I really appreciate you both coming on. I was wondering, is it okay if we share this recording with people? Feel free to, if you have any
I'm fine
concerns.
with it. We haven't said anything we haven't said before.
Okay.
It's fine.
Okay.
That's my bad, but yeah.
No problem. No problem at all. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Before we go, I just want to remind everyone that the new Tenant Talk print publication is out. This edition focuses on racial equity in housing, and I will share a link to that in follow-up email. And then we also have, I also wanted to let everyone know that the House voted on a relief package on Friday, and it passed on party lines. There's $40 billion in rental and homeless assistance in that package, so we're hopeful that it will pass for the next few weeks. They've set a deadline of March 14th, so we're hopeful with that. Other than that, Olivia, do you have anything, last words?
I'm putting the link to Tenant Talk in the chat.
Okay. And yeah, like I said, I will follow up with an email with information, and I think I might even share this chat in our follow-up email, because there's a lot of good points in here. So thanks everyone, and have a great night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Conversation. We appreciate you all.
Yeah.
Yes.
True.
Appreciate you.
Yeah. Thank you.